Inventing Reality. Section. Murder in Chile. In 1970, when a socialist candidate, Salvador Allende, was elected president of Chile and began initiating reforms, that country suddenly became the hottest news story in Latin America. From the beginning, the U.S. press saw the democratically elected government as an ominous threat to democracy. ABC's Howard K. Smith observed that the new, quote, Marxist government had, quote, outright communist internal policies. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post pondered whether Chile's, quote, free institutions could survive what the Times termed a, quote, sharp turn to the left. And a Los Angeles Times editorial discerned, quote, totalitarian inclinations in Chile. In fact, for almost 3 years, President Allende presided over a country whose citizens enjoyed a wide range of civil liberties, including freedom for all political organizations, even ultra-rightist ones. Most of the television stations, and some 2/3 of the country's radio stations, were controlled by the opposition, as were all the privately owned newspapers. The U.S. media never mentioned these facts. The U.S. press questioned the legitimacy of Allende's mandate by repeatedly reminding its audience that he was a, quote, minority president, having won only a 37% plurality. The press never mentioned that a conservative predecessor, Jorge Alessandri, had also been a minority president, not an unusual occurrence in Chilean multi-party politics, nor for that matter in American politics. Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Harry S. Truman, John F. Kennedy, and Richard M. Nixon had all been elected with less than a majority of the popular vote. What exactly was Allende doing to deserve such a bad press? He was moving toward an egalitarian, socialized society, having begun by nationalizing the copper mines owned by U.S. multinational corporations. And, under a statute passed in 1967 by a conservative Chilean Congress, but left largely unimplemented, his government was taking unused land from big estates and distributing it to landless peasants. Through a variety of government programs, agricultural production showed a dramatic upsurge. The inflation rate dropped by half. Construction was up 9%, and unemployment down to less than 5%, the lowest in a decade. Beef and bread consumption increased by 15% in the 1971-2 period. A government program sought to provide every Chilean child with a half-liter of milk daily. During Allende's first year, the economy enjoyed an 8.5% growth in GNP, the second highest in Latin America. Generally, Allende pursued the policies that threatened the prerogatives of the rich, cut into profits while increasing wages, and brought a modest redistribution of goods and services in favor of the poorer strata. In response, the Chilean business class withheld investments, hoarded supplies, and destroyed livestock. The United States eagerly assisted in this campaign to, quote, make the economy scream, President Nixon's phrase, by cutting off food aid, denying Chile any new loans, and cutting exports to Chile by some 40%, and imports from that country almost by half. Only the Chilean military flourished, being the recipient of a sumptuous $47 million in U.S. aid. The U.S. news media chose to ignore the fact that the Chilean economy was under assault from within and without, and nevertheless had been performing more democratically than under previous administrations. Instead, the press ran alarming reports of impending economic collapse. By 1973, acts of economic sabotage and political violence by rightists had become a daily occurrence. The democratic government was overthrown in September 1973 in a violent coup led by right-wing generals who abolished the Constitution, suppressed all political parties, closed all newspapers except 2 right-wing dailies, outlawed all independent trade unions, and arrested, tortured, and executed thousands of persons. Editorial opinion in the United States was remarkably mild, considering the press's seemingly arduous concern for the survival of Chilean democracy during Allende's tenure. The New York Times observed, quote, Dr. Allende and his Popular Unity Coalition, dominated by socialist and communist parties, attempted to socialize Chile. The government met stiff opposition from the upper and middle classes, and the armed forces, traditionally non-political, finally sided with the regime's opponents. End quote. These few sentences carry a bundle of deceptions. The socialist and communist parties who supposedly, quote, dominated the government were duly elected by the Chilean people and adhered strictly to constitutional procedures. They attempted to, quote, socialize Chile. But the Times did not explain what that phrase meant, what the government actually did, what programs it started for the people. Instead, quote, socializing Chile was presumed to have been something reprehensible. The Times said the government met, quote, stiff opposition from the upper and middle classes. In fact, it met political violence and economic sabotage. Nor did the armed forces, quote, finally side with the regime's opponents after much scrupulous neutrality. Far from being, quote, non-political, they plotted and conspired from the first months Allende took power, purging their ranks, aiding the efforts of right-wing terrorists, and disarming the few on the left who had guns. For the destruction of Chilean democracy, the U.S. press tended to blame the victims themselves. Thus, in an editorial immediately after the coup, the New York Times noted, quote, no Chilean party or faction can escape some responsibility for the disaster, but a heavy share must be assigned to the unfortunate Dr. Allende himself. Even when the dangers of polarization had become unmistakingly evident, he persisted in pushing a program of pervasive socialism for which he had no popular mandate. End quote. The last to be blamed by the U.S. press for the military takeover was the military itself. Also free of blame was the U.S. government, which financed, equipped, trained, advised, and assisted the Chilean military before, during, and after the takeover. The leading U.S. newspapers took pains to report there was no evidence of U.S. involvement in the destruction of Chilean democracy. To reach this conclusion, they also had to ignore the economic war waged by Washington and the CIA's funding of opposition right-wing political parties and media in Chile. When Allende was in office, and long after his death, he was inevitably described as a, quote, Marxist by the U.S. press, which he was, and his government was often called, quote, Marxist, which it was not, being a loose coalition of left-leaning political groups, some of which were reformists and decidedly non-Marxist. In contrast, neither General Augusto Pinochet nor his government was ever described as, quote, fascist, which they were, by any of the establishment news organizations in the United States. Allende's democratically elected government was, quote, the Allende regime, while Pinochet's dictatorship was more respectfully described as, quote, the Chilean government, in the years immediately following the coup. The day after he was murdered by the generals, Allende was portrayed unsympathetically in the New York Times as, quote, a man of the privileged class turned radical politician, end quote, known for his, quote, dandy ways and stylish dress. And a few days later, quote, Allende was very much a political animal, a small, stocky, quick-moving man with a gray mustache, ruddy face, thick, heavily rimmed spectacles, end quote. In contrast, the Times described Allende's executioner, General Pinochet, as, quote, a powerfully built six-footer, energetic and very disciplined, and until recently he never talked politics, end quote. He was also, quote, quiet and businesslike, and though, quote, tough, he had a, quote, sense of humor. Certainly here was a mass murderer we could all warm up to. It was Pinochet's unmentionable fascism, rather than his vaunted, quote, sense of humor, that had the upper hand in his regime's treatment of political prisoners arrested after the coup. The tortures delivered upon Pinochet's victims included application of electric shock to different parts of the body, particularly the genitals, forcing victims to witness the torture of friends and relatives, raping women in the presence of other family members, burning sex organs with acid or scalding water, placing infected rats into the vagina, mutilating, puncturing, and cutting off various parts of the body, including genitalia, eyes, and tongue, injection of air into a woman's breasts and veins, causing slow, painful death, shoving bayonets and clubs into the vagina or anus, causing rupture and death. By 1980, 6.5 years of Pinochet's rule had given Chile continued political and economic oppression. Yet the New York Times could headline a story, quote, Chile's regime sees new economic hope. A kind of positive framing never accorded the Allende government. In upbeat tones, the opening paragraph told how Pinochet ordered the construction of a new $20 million jail. His willingness to respond to prison overcrowding, the Times maintained with a straight face, reflected, quote, both sensitivity to social criticism and a new ability to pay for public investments, end quote. Pinochet believed his policy of free market capitalism, quote, offers solutions to basic problems like jobs, housing, health, and social security, end quote. The Times remained willing to give the free market dictator the benefit of the doubt, even if it meant offering doublethink sentences like this. Beginning of long quote. Critics of Pinochet's economic policies generally agree that the situation today is an improvement over the breakdown in 1973. But they emphasize persistent unemployment, which is about 15% of the labor force, and indications that wealth is increasingly concentrated in an elite, with wage earners and peasants making less than before. End of long quote. In other words, the economy had improved, but the people were worse off. In fact, Pinochet's critics did not agree that the economic situation in Chile under the dictator represented an improvement over the Allende years. Outdoing the Times was Shirley Christian of the Miami Herald. For years, she produced stories about how Pinochet was adored by his subjects, how he had rescued Chile's economy from Marxist ruination, how he was, quote, like an iron-willed father pounding at the head of the table, and how he was, quote, tough and in charge, speaks his mind. Peace, tranquility, order. Pinochet has brought Chile those things. End quote. not the tyranny of military rule, mass arrests, executions, disappearances, and torture. In 1984, 11 years after the coup, the New York Times was still cooing over General Pinochet, describing him in one news story as the, quote, Chilean president and Chile's leader, never as Chile's dictator, whose, quote, 68 years are belied by his boxer's physique, matched by a trim gray mustache, end quote. He, quote, seemed relaxed and expansive as he sat down to breakfast in Moneda Palace, end quote. The Moneda's previous occupant, quote, Salvador Allende Gossens, a Marxist, died inside, end quote. Allende actually was murdered by Pinochet's forces. Pinochet, continued the Times, quote, has managed to stay in power through what even his opponents recognize as political acumen, end quote. Not terror, death squads, and U.S. military aid. After chiding Pinochet for, quote, his excesses, a Times editorial praised him for having, quote, brought order to street and factory and renewed economic growth, while the poor were consoled with record levels of social spending, end quote. In fact, Pinochet's policies brought a drastic drop in real wages, an upward redistribution of income to benefit the rich, a sharp growth in unemployment, a huge increase in the foreign debt, a fall in savings, massive corruption and racketeering by the military, and heartless cutbacks for the poor. The milk program for Chilean children was abolished almost immediately after the generals came to power, and health, sanitation, housing, and community services were subjected to drastic cuts. The public sector was sharply reduced in a massive bargain-priced sell-off to private businesses. In 1988, 15 years after the coup, the Times could still not stop heaping praise upon the Chilean dictator for having transformed Chile's, quote, sluggish, copper-dependent economy into a success story, quote, based on private investment. This transformation would not have gone so far, so fast, had not his economists been backed by the regime's dictatorial powers. Reform attempts in such nearby democracies as Argentina, Brazil, and Ecuador are even now continuing to falter. End quote. Here, the New York Times endorsed dictatorship over democracy as the means to creating, quote, economic success. But success for whom? Even the Times had to admit that, quote, left behind were large numbers of the urban poor, who live less well than they did 15 years ago, end quote. What we were not told is that the prime beneficiaries of Chile's, quote, economic success were the top military and the rich corporate investors. For all their professed dedication to democracy, the U.S. media have been less critical of democracy's mortal enemies in Chile than of capitalism's democratic opponents. End of section.